Hello, 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 and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and we are headed back to Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital for more information on the largest Kirkbride hospital ever built. But before we get there, really quickly, I want to say that my thoughts are with everyone affected by the fires in Southern California. Many of my patients and my patients' family members and my colleagues have been affected by these fires, so that area has been heavily on my mind. I am further north, so fortunately I'm safe, but I was just down in LA last month, and the areas where I was staying have been hit really hard. So if you're listening from that area, please stay safe. I am thinking of you. If you'd like to help from wherever you are, you can join me in donating to various organizations. I personally donated to the Pasadena Humane Society and World Central Kitchen, so you can join me in donating to those or others. I'll include a list of other places you can donate. There are so many places impacted by these fires, and the need is only going to continue. Obviously, since this is close to home, this is also close to my heart. All right. Back to the episode. My main trigger warning for this episode is the use of outdated and ableist language. My main sources for this week will be the annual reports from Greystone Park found on the New Jersey State Library website and the Images of America book on Greystone Park by Rusty Taglierini and Christina Matthews. So for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Greystone Park Psychiatric Center. We left off last week in 1908. Dr. Evans was asking once again for relief from the overcrowding at the hospital. By the end of the fiscal year in 1909, there were over 2,000 patients at the hospital. And remember that the asylum had originally been built with extra capacity for patients. It could house 800 patients, and now they were over twice that limit. And the problem was that the asylum couldn't refuse admissions. If a judge or doctor in the community certified someone as insane, the asylum had to accept them. And so, by the October 31st report of 1909, Dr. Evans was begging for the state for more help. For 20 years, he said, we've been asking the state to do something about the overcrowding. He said there was the same number of staff there had been as there were when there were half of the patients. There was only him as the medical director plus 6 other physicians, about 1 doctor for every 350 patients. There's simply no way that all 350 patients could be seen every day unless the doctor worked a full 16-hour day with no breaks. And even then, the visit would be minimal. Also problematic, Dr. Evans noted, was the fact that the main kitchen was extremely insufficient for feeding the amount of patients and staff required each day. It was down in the basement, so it got miserably hot during the summer, making it difficult to retain staff. The appliances were outdated and made it difficult to feed really anyone. Couldn't the state and the powers that be see that they were desperate and had waited long enough? There were some reprieves in the meantime. Although the population soared to 2,672 in 1911, by 1912, a nursing cottage for men had opened so that the residences that had been used for staff in the main building could be used for patients. A separate building for tuberculosis patients opened the same year, which allowed for sick patients to be isolated, again opening up more space. But between the 2 buildings, we're talking about making room for a maximum of 100 to 150 people, and more than that were coming in each year. In 1912, the hospital started a eugenics research board led by 2 trained eugenicists. These women went from one patient's home to the next, making notes on where they suspected the mental illness actually came from and whether or not it may have been genetically linked. By 1914, World War I had started in Europe, and Dr. Evans sounded absolutely done in his annual report. Here's the beginning of the report, read as I assume he wrote it, in a bleak and resigned tone. Quote, "Gentlemen, I have the honor of herewith submitting to you the 39th annual report of the medical department of this hospital. Its contents cover the hospital year beginning November 1st, 1913 and ending October 31st, 1914. No effort has been made to write into this report superfluous scientific matters. It is intended to present in a plain and practical way such matters and things as the public is entitled to know, and to set forth pertinent fact and incidents as are calculated to be of educational worth." End quote. Doesn't he just sound over it all? No effort has been made, as he said. I can't blame him. It would feel useless asking the same thing every year with no results. And he continues on. Quote, "It is unfortunate that many serious problems to which I have called attention in my reports for several years confront us unremedied, and that it is necessary to again make them a part of this report with another appeal in interest of those who are detained in this institution under the laws of the state. I realize that in calling attention to the same subjects from year to year, I face the danger of criticism from frequent repetitions. I have taken this risk with the hope of bringing about helpful results. It is unfortunate that many of our most intelligent citizens, men and women of sincerity and honesty purpose, who are desirous of charging faithfully the responsibilities resting upon them, fail to read carefully the annual reports of our public charitable institutions, and for this reason remain in comparative ignorance of actual institutional needs and the character of the work being done." End quote. And I gotta say, go Dr. Evans. He's like, you're not going to read this, but I still have to write it, so let me tell you what I really think. And you know, for as burdened as he sounds, Dr. Evans seems to really care about the welfare of the patients and staff. Throughout his writing, it's pretty clear that he wants patients to be getting the treatment that they need, not merely warehoused. And he wants his staff to be able to do their work safely, and after work to be able to rest for a while until their next shift. It doesn't seem like that much to ask. And yet he's incredibly limited. I cannot imagine how awful it must have been to have worked there at this time and to feel simultaneously overwhelmed and helpless. In the same report, Dr. Evans again states that there needs to be a separate facility for the criminally insane because housing them together with the civilly committed individuals was incredibly dangerous for everybody. He offers this story as an illustration for the need for a separate facility. Quote, "William Wall, convict, was transferred from the Rahway Reformatory to this institution on May 5th, 1913. He is well known by the police of Paternon and in vicinity, where he gained notoriety in the underworld for his dexterity in entering and robbing houses along the Passaic River. His family history indicates that he is but one of several generations of expert housebreakers." End quote. Now, I have questions about this. First, what is this family activity of breaking and entering? Are they just all really good at it? Do the parents teach their kids? Like, what's happening here? But anyway, as violating as breaking and entering is, we don't actually know if William Wall used violence in these crimes. If he were breaking in, stealing things, and leaving, that would probably equate to burglary today. But if you were breaking in and using threat or force to take things directly from people, well, that's a different story. That would be violent. And I only bring this up because criminal matters, of course, aren't always violent. So to make the assumption that someone who has been found guilty of a criminal offense is violent may or may not be justified. Anyway, he continued with the story, and spoiler alert, it turns out that William Wall is very dangerous after all. Quote, about 4:45 a.m. of June 28th, 1914, the night patrol, Edward Carroll, noticed Wall was not in his bed, and he and attendant Patrick J. Collins searched the ward and found the patient. He was located walking the long hall fully dressed and was taken to his bed and told to undress and retire. The night patrol then noticed that the door of one of the rooms was open, and he and attendant Collins went to investigate. Wall waited until the nurses had turned their backs and then shouted at them to throw up their hands or he would shoot. He immediately fired, and attendant Collins rushed towards him. Wall fired 3 shots, and attendant Collins was struck by one of the bullets, which penetrated the left chest about 1 inch above the heart and lodged in the muscles in the lower part of the back. Attendant Collins was in bed and in a dangerous condition for weeks, but eventually made a satisfactory recovery. He deserves great credit for his courage and daring in struggling with Wall and overpowering him, even after the criminal had fired a bullet into his body. About 3 days previous to this incident, Wall, the patient, was visited by 2 men who claimed to be near relatives, and they are suspected of giving him the revolver with which he did the shooting. Since this occurrence has been under doubly close watch, but despite this, he managed to tear off a buckle of his suspenders and make of it a screwdriver and used it to undo a window guard, after which he broke the window frame and escaped from the hospital. A week later, he was arrested by the Paterson police and returned to his hospital. It is necessary to keep him under close watch night and day, which entails much expense. End quote. And again, I can appreciate the difficulty in this. At all the state hospitals where I've worked, well, psychiatric or medical, having a patient on enhanced observation for any reason takes a staff member off the floor, which can be very taxing. Obviously, this is done for the safety of the patient and sometimes for the safety of others, but I can't imagine they had anywhere near enough staff for a 1-to-1 observation back in 1913. The 1914 annual report also noted that patients with psychosis were being injected with a combination of sodium nucleate and arsenic trioxide to see if that helped the symptoms. A few people seemed to benefit, but on the whole, Dr. Evans didn't think it would be beneficial. They were injecting arsenic. By 1915, the Great War was in full force over in Europe, and the U.S. was feeling the devastating effects, even though it wasn't yet a part of it. Overcrowding continued to be a huge problem, of course, and because of the war, foreign patients couldn't be sent back to their home countries. There were 2,669 total patients and an almost equal number of men and women. 1,335 men, 1,334 women. The worst part was that the hospital had essentially returned to a custodial facility. The recovery rate, which was calculated by the number of successful discharges per year, had fallen from 38.89% in previous years to 15% in 1915. So they were accepting more and more patients, but not discharging nearly as many. Dr. Evans seems to realize that not many know what the admissions process is like, so he outlines it in the 1915 report. Quote, "The question is often asked, what is done for a patient when he is brought to the institution? I have thought it well to enumerate some of the various steps taken to collate the history of the patient and the methods used to arrive at a correct diagnosis. When the patient arrives, the commitment papers are carefully examined to determine whether or not they comply in all respects with the law. A case record envelope is then prepared and numbered. An admission record card is given to the supervisor who takes the patient from the reception room to the ward. A card bearing the patient's name and religion is sent to the ward with the patients. This card follows the patient from ward to ward during his stay at the institution. The statistical clerk makes his admission records from the commitment papers, recording all the data in the commitment papers as to the patient's age, nativity, parentage, religion, relatives, etc. A record card giving the eugenic history as fully as the commitment papers contain it is sent to the office of the eugenic research workers. A letter is immediately mailed to the relatives of the patient, informing them of the admission and requesting them to visit the institution in order to give a more detailed history or designate some time when a research worker may call. A diversional occupation index card is sent to the industrial building. This card is used in selecting a beneficial diversional occupation or amusement for the patient. An index card giving the name and other data pertaining to the patient is sent to the laboratory, and this card is used in recording Wassermann reactions and other laboratory tests. A case record photo mount is sent to the studio, and when the patient has been photographed, the picture is filed in the record office. The nurses keep an accurate record of the patient's conduct and conversations for 14 days, and at the end of this period, the report is returned to the medical offices and reviewed by physicians. It then becomes a part of the patient's history. As soon as the patient is admitted, a special clinical note blank is given to the physician assigned to examine the patient. The patient is presented at the next regular staff meeting. The commitment papers, the mental and physical examination, the eugenics research report, and the results of all special tests are read and discussed. The patient is then brought into the consultation room and questioned by the physicians present. A stenographer takes down what is said by the patient during the examination, and at which is suitable for the record is filed in the case envelope. If the staff cannot agree on a definite diagnosis the first time the patient is presented, further discussion is deferred, and the patient is again presented for further careful examination and observation. End quote. I actually really appreciate that diagnosing a patient was a collaborative effort that took in multiple aspects of the patient's presentation and health, but holy cows, I also cannot imagine how intimidating it must have been for the patient to go in front of all the doctors in the hospital and sort of be paraded around in front of them. Yikes. Even though the U.S. wasn't yet involved in the war, the hospital experienced difficulties because of it. Dr. Evans reported that basic commodities were priced 50 to 200% higher than usual, so their food was highly rationed. There was decreased immigration in general, so foreign-born patients had to remain put, even if they didn't have anywhere to go in the community. There was a spot of good news, though. A new facility opened up in New Jersey for folks with epilepsy, so for the first time, the hospital was able to transfer out 52 patients. And that must have felt like a drop in the bucket, but at least it was something. I can only imagine Dr. Evans's face when he learned about a new commitment law that was approved on July 4th, 1916. It fortunately allowed patients 10 days instead of the current 6 to get to the hospital, which that must have been helpful. But it also approved the admission of voluntary indigent patients. So in other words, there would be even more patients who could not pay. Even more people to house and feed when they already didn't have room. More people who wouldn't be able to get the treatment they needed. I can only imagine how hopeless he must have felt. And what was almost worse, the hospital had a problem with looky-loos, people from the community who just wanted to drive by and see what was going on, maybe catch a glimpse of the patients doing God knows what. Dr. Evans wanted a large fence or a watch house built just to keep an eye on who was entering the grounds. Can you imagine, in the midst of everything else going on, to have to worry about keeping the public out? Anyway, but as a positive distraction from the chaos, Dr. Evans started a patient-run newsletter at the hospital called the Psychogram. And here's a short excerpt about what he said about it. Quote, "In order to bring the patient in touch in closer touch with his friends and relatives, the publication of a monthly magazine was started July 1st. The title, Psychogram, which was given to the magazine, has a significant connotation and is intended to convey to the general public in a very modest way the unusual capabilities of people who are unfortunately afflicted with mental disorders. The initial and subsequent issues of the Psychogram received very favorable comment from the lay and medical press. The quality of the typographic work which has been done on the Psychogram has been a source of surprise to several expert authorities on printing, and very, very favorable comment has been received from them in regard to the high quality of the work accomplished. The extra demands made upon the patients for the production of this publication have not only awakened new interest in patients possessing literary ability, but have also helped a great deal to bring out a few more patients who had had experience as printers before they came to the institution, or who showed ability in this art and desired to share somewhat in the glory of this modest publication." End quote. This was a great way to have patients share their writing and poetic abilities, artistic abilities, and skills they used in previous jobs. Some state hospitals and prisons today have similar newsletters. Most of them are internal, simply because of patient privacy concerns. But others, like the newspaper out of San Quentin State Prison, get distributed to other institutions, so others can benefit from it too. In 1917, the U.S. had declared war on Austria-Hungary and entered World War I. The draft took some staff members, while others left the hospital for other war efforts where they'd earn higher wages. The hospital was dangerously understaffed, especially regarding physicians, so Dr. Henry Cotton from the hospital in Trenton sent over 4 of his staff members to help fill the need. The hospital was able to transfer 31 patients to the New Jersey State Village for Epileptics and another 50 criminally insane to the House of Detention for Criminals, but it did little to relieve the pressure of overcrowding. There were now close to 2,700 patients. I noticed that at some point, Dr. Evans essentially moved the goalposts, if you will, of what was an acceptable patient population. At the beginning of his tenure, he'd write in the annual report that there could be no more than 1,000 patients. And then a few years later, he said no more than 1,600. And now he was saying the absolute most they could handle was 1,650. But they were 1,000 over that already. 1918 brought even more staffing vacancies. There were now 3 openings for physicians out of the usual 6, and more women were being called for nursing duties in the war. Supplies were hard to come by, so the hospital relied on food substitutes as much as possible. Still, Dr. Evans said in his annual report, the hospital was able to purchase an automobile truck for deliveries and transports and offer better quality moving pictures for patients' entertainment. The end of the war finally came, but now there were new problems. The 1918 and 1919 Spanish flu epidemic hit the hospital hard. 70 patients died from influenza during the outbreak. They were, however, able to discharge more patients now that the war was over. 667 patients discharged, and 109 were transferred to Trenton. By the end of the fiscal year, on June 30th, 1919, there were a reported 2,669 patients at Greystone. The stress of his job and the devastation during war must have taken their toll on Dr. Evans. By January 14th, 1920, Dr. Evans, quote, died at his post of duty, end quote. He had served as the superintendent and medical director of the New Jersey State Insane Asylum since 1892. He was 61 years old. And although his cause of death isn't listed, I wonder if perhaps he suffered a fatal heart attack while working. He certainly had a very stressful job and was likely working longer hours while short-staffed. Regarding his death, however he died, the board of directors wrote the following in their annual report. Quote, For more than a quarter of a century, Dr. Evans had served as the medical head of this institution, devoting to it the crowning years of his life. As a psychiatrist and an executive, he commanded high respect, and as a man, affectionate and loyal esteem. In his death, we not only lost a valued superintendent, but a beloved personal friend. End quote. And that's really a lovely accolade for someone who clearly worked hard and advocated for patients. Even though I'm sure the conditions of the hospital were atrocious, I don't think it was for lack of trying on Dr. Evans' part. He seemed to be doing the best he could with what was given to him. Dr. Marcus Curry, who had been a longtime physician at Greystone, took over as acting superintendent on January 16th. He was officially appointed to the job on March 12, 1920. And he had a very difficult task ahead of him, continuing to advocate for the patient's needs in the midst of a post-war recession and a new mental health challenge. Specifically, that war veterans were coming back with some sort of strange psychosis that no one had ever seen before. He called these war risk patients and noted that there was a sudden increase of admissions of folks who had been in the Great War, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of it. There were other strange things happening around the time. Patients in the hospital and people in the community were presenting with what doctors were calling psychic phenomena. You may be familiar with what was happening in society in the aftermath of World War I. There was so much death and devastation following the war that people needed answers and closures to the deaths of their loved ones. And this sparked a belief that was later called spiritualism. I'm no expert on this movement, but the essential idea is that people wanted to be able to contact their deceased loved ones and know that they were okay. So many people turned to psychics and mediums and Ouija boards in an attempt to speak to those they had lost. Grief can make anyone desperate for relief. For Dr. Curry, as the new medical director, he was trying to parse out how much of this was psychosis and how much of it was spiritualism. He devoted an entire section of his 1920 annual report to this matter. And here's what he writes. Quote, "A state hospital must always, to a certain extent, reflect any variation from normal conditions in the surrounding community. Seasons of financial panic, great religious revivals, war conditions, even the lighter fads and fancies of the people produce a degree of mental stress or conflict which acts in certain individuals as the culminating factor for a psychosis. At present, a wave of interest in occult and psychic phenomenon is sweeping the country, which is calculated to bring an unusual number of patients into the institution. The people who seize upon spiritualism in its varied forms are too often either those who are naturally of a high-strung neurotic tendency or who have just passed through some great trouble which has temporarily deprived them of normal resistance. The conditions of mystery and emotional strain which surround the seances are particularly dangerous for people of this type. Their minds are fixed on unhealthful topics. They are induced to make every effort to feel sensations, hear voices, and receive messages from the world of spirits. In individuals of neurotic or hysterical makeup, the step is all too short from the seance to the actual hallucinations of sight, touch, and hearing, and from the idea of direction by some dead friend through the medium of the Ouija board to defined illusions of influence and guidance. In fact, it would be difficult to imagine conditions more favorable for the development of a psychosis than those furnished by repeated visits to mediums and seances with constant morbid dwelling upon supernatural manifestation. And if popular taste does not soon swing to some more wholesome diversion, the state hospitals are destined to receive a new influx of patients." End quote. I kind of get his point. On the one hand, some people who are more vulnerable to mental illness may be too easily swayed to say that they see or hear or feel things. And maybe they actually were before the spiritualism started, and now that's what they're attributing it to. There's no way to really know. But I also think that having an outlet for their grief that brings peace must have been helpful for other people. I can see how the practice could be helpful for some and harmful for others. If I were Dr. Curry, looking at my already bulging hospital building and bracing myself for a wave of new commitments, I might be worried too. To help delegate some of his duties, a clinical director position was established. Dr. Arthur G. Lane was named as the first clinical director of the hospital. He would take over some of the more administrative aspects of the hospital so that Dr. Curry could focus on the medical tasks. One of Dr. Lane's duties would be to work on reestablishing treatment for all of the patients. Staffing was particularly tight that year. Dr. Curry wrote that the staff-to-patient ratio should be about 1 to 10, but it was currently running anywhere around 1 to 25 to 1 to 100. And then came a particularly problematic issue. The hospital wanted to offer bonuses to bring in new staff members. But then right off the bat, those new staff members were earning more than the staff who had been there for years through the thick and thin of wartime conditions. And understandably, some of those veteran staff members just scoffed and paced out, leaving the hospital right in the same trouble it had been before. Whoops. Following the war, there was a slight economic boom for the hospital. They were able to put some funding toward constructing new buildings for the staff and patients. In 1922, the psychiatric reception building was completed with room for 400 patients. At the time of the 1922 report, it hadn't quite opened yet, but they were hopeful that it would soon. There were also 5 buildings under construction that would be staff lodging. That way, they could move out of the main building where patients were housed. Even Dr. Lane, the new clinical director, and his wife lived in cramped quarters next to an active ward for 2 years while the new staff buildings were underway. 4 years after the war ended, there was an entire ward dedicated to servicemen who were war risk patients. And clearly they were a favorite. Dr. Curry writes the following, quote, "No group of patients in this institution received more attention or excites more interest, both on the part of the hospital officials and of friends and welfare workers outside, than the ex-servicemen. In addition to the regular hospital furnishings, which include a piano, special donations have been made to the soldiers, such as a Victrola, records, magazines, pictures, and various luxuries, sent in through the generosity of the American Legion posts, Red Cross societies, and sympathetic friends. And at Christmas time, this ward was almost overwhelmed with gifts. In cooperation with the hospital officials, these men have worked out different methods of recreation and entertainment. One sport which afforded a great deal of fun and exercise during the winter months was basketball, their team making a creditable showing against the regular hospital players. In the summer, they organized a baseball team and played games frequently, even challenging outside clubs." End quote. He goes on to say that, even though they're a clear favorite, they would probably be better served in a different facility with other folks like them. And it sounds to me like he's advocating for a VA hospital. Dr. Curry added in his report that he hoped to introduce a social work department to the hospital in order to make discharges to the community more effective. And, fortunately, he was able to do that in 1922, when they added 2 social workers for the first time. The last point from the 1922 annual report I just have to include because of our series on Dr. Cotton and the asylum at Trenton. You might remember, it's been a while, that Dr. Cotton believed that mental illness was caused by infections around the body, but particularly in the teeth. So he had many, many patients' teeth pulled with the hope of curing their mental illness. It didn't work, but darn it, he just kept right on trying. And I don't know for sure, but this kind of feels like a snub against Dr. Cotton. After offering a general overview of the dental procedures for the year, Dr. Curry says this, quote, "It is not our purpose to leave our patients with a deficient masticatory apparatus. With a well-equipped technical laboratory, complete or partial dentures, cast clasp, and inlay work is done," end quote. And I don't know, doesn't it just feel like he's saying, we want our patients to have teeth and we take care of the teeth so we don't have to pull them all? At least that's the sense that I get. More construction and models were completed over the next couple of years while the patient population continued to grow rapidly. By 1924, there were 3,364 patients at the hospital, 1,661 men, and 1,703 women. A new dining hall was added to the women's wing of the hospital. Staff living quarters were remodeled, and there were also plans to build 2 new convalescent cottages, more employee housing, and a new kitchen. The numbers of staff were also going up. 1924 saw the introduction of a few new jobs: the matron of staff, who would oversee nurses and floor staff, an on-site ear, nose, and throat specialist, and a physician who is entirely dedicated to the electrotherapy department. Which, by the way, I mentioned briefly the electrotherapy department in the last episode. This was not electroconvulsive therapy. That hadn't been invented yet, but it was used as a diagnostic measure, particularly for digestive tract issues. They discuss it briefly in the 1924 report, where they say that it offered X-ray treatments for carcinoma and epithelioma. And the most common procedure was something called static head breeze. The pictures I found look a little like when you take a balloon and rub it up against your hair and then your hair sticks straight up. I'll try to include a picture. If anyone knows more about this treatment and what it was for, please let me know. But perhaps most notably, it was in 1924 that the hospital was officially renamed the New Jersey State Hospital at Greystone Park. And you know what? I think I'm going to end on that note. You may remember from your history lessons that a lot is going to happen over the next 20 years. We've got a major economic depression coming up, another world war, and an overcrowding crisis at the hospital. We'll also start to see Dr. Curry's early annual reports, which read as hopeful and grateful, start to shift to sound a little bit more like Dr. Evans' reports did, shifting to dread and despair. So stay tuned for an action-packed episode. As always, thank you so much for listening. And since it's been a while, I thought I'd just give a brief update on where most of you are listening. 82% of you are listening in either the US or Australia. And per usual, Melbourne has the highest number of listeners by far. So thank you so much to all my friends down under. I'm sorry, I said I would never do that again. But thank you for listening wherever you are. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening. It doesn't take too long, but I would love it if you gave the show a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, add a sentence or two about what you like about the show. It would mean the world to me. You can support the show on Patreon or Buzzsprout, but the best way to support is to keep listening and to share with someone else who might like it too. But as always, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.